Hello everyone. Normally I'd like to be in the crowd a bit more, but I've been told because of the banner and the microphone I have to stay behind the lectern. I'm Karen Lowry. I'm talking about their people, not users. The only thing you really need to know about me for this talk is on the main slide, and that's I'm a graphic design lecturer. I currently teach sessionally at Curtin University, teaching in the graphic design degree, so if you do have graduates come through that don't know what they're talking about, that's probably my fault. So I'm just going to give a shout out to all the sponsors that make today possible, as well as all the volunteers and the committee members who are giving their time to put together this great conference for us. So today what I want to talk about is human-centered design, and this is a term that's actually coined by Don Norman. Don Norman wrote a really great book called The Design of Everyday Things that I highly recommend. And he says the goal is to produce a great product, one that is successful and that customers love. It can be done. So this is all about empathy, which is something that we are familiar with many from UX design. And we're looking here at putting people first. We're looking past the visuals, but unlike what we see in UX design, we're actually also looking past the functionality to focus on the thoughts and the feelings of the people who are using your app and your product. So how do we do that? Well, most of the time we'd start with a persona. So let's meet Ben. Ben is a software developer here in Perth. He's married, he doesn't have any kids, he's got terrible taste in music, and he enjoys rock climbing and running as his two main hobbies. Once we've written our persona, we might make some scenarios. And chances are, once we've written those scenarios, the language that we use to talk about Ben changes. We might find we start using words like user, like visitor, click, subscriber, traffic, customer, the language goes on. These words are actually quite problematic because they focus themselves on the role of the user when they're using your product. We assign a role to them based on that interaction and based on how we intend to profit from them. Don Norman, who I mentioned coined the term human experience design, is actually the one who coined the term user experience design. And he developed what we call human-centered design because he also thought these words were quite problematic. Because Ben is none of those things. Ben's a person. So the first thing that we really need to be doing here is changing our terminology and calling our audience people. They're not users, they're not visitors, and they're not clicks. This is a really small change that we can be making in our internal documents in our company, but it actually allows us to refocus our team on what's important. And that's this big, messy, complicated experience that we call being human, and the fact that your app's only one small part of that. Because let's face it, being human is complicated. Just look at Ben. Ben screws up a lot. Do you really think you can account for all of the different ways Ben manages to screw up on an almost daily basis? Ben is lazy. Ben doesn't like having to get up in the mornings. He'll often leave for work at the last possible moment. He's unpredictable. Not even his wife can sometimes predict some of the behaviour that he manages and the decisions that he makes. He's very complex. Like most of us, Ben will often believe in contradictory things at the same time and get in very heated arguments about them. Ben also wastes a lot of time. He'll spend a lot of time on his phone browsing Reddit, a lot of time watching TV. When we use language like visitor, like user, we are suggesting that there's a such thing as an ideal user for our app. And there is no ideal user. That doesn't exist. We don't know the situation Ben's going to be in when he uses our app. We don't know the environment. We don't know how he's going to be thinking or feeling. So we really need to be thinking about how we can change this terminology and think of Ben as being human. Because if we don't do this, Ben's going to find our app really frustrating to use. And when Ben gets frustrated, when he does screw up, it's not Ben's fault. Ben's very good at blaming other people. It'll always be your fault as the designer. A way around this, as I tell my students when I'm teaching, is to ask why. You want to ask why 5 times is a guide that I give my students. And we do this because human error is never the answer. If the answer you've come up with is that it's Ben's fault, you have to keep digging because Ben will not accept the blame. You need to look beyond the feature that Ben's gotten stuck at and look at the problem with the system itself. Because Ben cares about a lot more than your product. So we need to look beyond the product itself, beyond the features that you've developed. Ben himself, he cares about climate change. He's quite concerned about the world. He's very aware, given he's a developer, about how his data is being used and about the kinds of permissions that he's granting the apps that he uses. Ben's much less likely to use your app if it's not ethical. Now, I'm going to put a little asterisk here because human-centered design doesn't have to be ethical, and we see plenty of examples that aren't. But human-centered design is about focusing on the experience and creating a positive experience for people using your app. So it should always be ethical. And when we're talking about ethics, what we're really talking about is the respect that you have for your users. People are more aware now than ever before, thanks to shows like The Social Dilemma on Netflix, about the social responsibility the people making their media should have. So the very first element we need to consider when we're talking about ethics is human rights, making sure that you protect the fundamental human rights that your app has. So we're looking here about your social responsibility at the very core. You want to make sure your app is transparent, accessible, and sustainable. So you don't want to deceive users. A really good example of this is the Twitter blue tick. When we see a blue tick on Twitter, we often see it as holding some kind of power. We see it as representing a status symbol of power and recognition. No one has really exemplified this more than the way people have reacted to Donald Trump on Twitter before he got banned. The blue tick actually just recognises a high-profile user. It stops other people from impersonating them. That's all that does. But the decision that Twitter made to use a tick as a symbol very much changes the reaction we have as an audience to that symbol. We want to also be transparent in and upfront about the purchases people might need to make in our products. We've all heard of microtransactions. EA Games made the news a few years ago, 2018, 2017, over microtransactions. The microtransaction industry is still massive. In 2021, it was worth $60 billion. So there is definitely a lot of money to be made here. But is it ethical? EA Games had developed what they called loot boxes as a way to advance faster in their games. We saw Belgium in 2018 ban these loot boxes as a form of gambling. That actually got overturned briefly. And it got overturned because the actual legislation that defined what gambling is didn't cover this form of in-game purchases in apps. But while the law wasn't really up to speed, and still isn't in many countries, around our use of microtransactions, it doesn't make it ethical. Do we really want our kids and our teens in these apps, potentially with your credit card, making these purchases and learning from a really young age to gamble rather than putting in the effort for gameplay? Your product should also aim to reduce inequality, which is a really important aspect of human rights. This comes down to learnability, thinking about how easy it is for first-time users, and also that dreaded word that I'm sure we all find frustrated with at times, compatibility. Making sure it works backwards across different devices. Our next element is respecting human effort. So your app should be functional, It should also be trustworthy and reliable. You want to respect the effort that we're actually putting into using your app. So you want to respect privacy here. You want to only collect information from the people that are using your app that's absolutely necessary to be using it. We are more aware than ever, as I said, about the kinds of permissions that we're granting when we use apps. You also want to think about the extent to which you as a designer or a developer are actually going to influence the behaviour of the people who use your app. A really good example of this comes from a book called Stolen Focus by Johann Hari. This book looks at the different ways that our attention spans have actually reduced. And it just looks at ways beyond just technology and beyond social media. But it does have, understandably, quite a few chapters about social media. And in it, Johann talks about the creator of the scroll feed and says that the creator of the scroll feed actually deeply regretted his decision and being a part of this creation. And it did what it was supposed to. It kept people on the app, it kept people there for longer, allowing them to collect more data, sell more ads, and make more money. But it didn't respect effort that people were putting into being in that app. We compare this to Netflix. Netflix, after you've watched a few episodes, gives you a notification asking if you're still there. It is thanks to this notification that Ben makes it to bed on time at night. So the last aspect we've got is where we really see this link with human-centered design, and that's creating positive experiences. This is about the emotional connection people have with your product. It should be delightful, it should be intuitive, and it should be invisible. If your app works well, I shouldn't notice the interactions I'm having in it. It should be that easy to use. If I'm having to think about it, you've done something wrong. Now, we can't consider ethics without also considering the wider community, because Ben is part of a bigger community. Our design has to focus on the entire activity under consideration, not just the smaller components you have. And this is a reason why we all have terms like feature creep in our terminology. Ben is part of a much bigger system than your app. He's part of the software community here in WA and in Australia. We need to be sensitive to the history and the culture and the beliefs of the structures and the community that we're designing for. And you can't do this on your own. Even if you have a team of people whose job this is, you cannot do this on your own. You need to be talking to the community that are going to be involved in your app. Which means you can't just talk to Ben. Ben is very privileged. Ben is white and male. Ben has no ongoing health conditions. Ben's got a full-time job with a good salary. Ben has a bachelor degree. He's paid off his HECS debt, something I'm sure not many of us can say. And Ben is heterosexual and married. Being people-centred means you have to consider all of the people who are involved. If we use healthcare as an example, this means the patients, this means the doctors, the families, the general practitioners, specialists, technicians, nurses, the list goes on. You need to think about everybody in that community. Now, how do you actually do this? Well, there's obvious solutions with connecting with stakeholders, doing field interviews, setting up meetings, going out and observing in the different industries, and this can be costly. I'd like to note here that it's not as costly as spending a year developing something that the community doesn't actually want. But you should also consider the ways you can use your current channels to be engaging in this process. For example, I always have an open communication channel that I invite stakeholders to. And I can really quickly and easily drop in issues that we're having, questions we might have, and keep the community on board with the progress we're making in the app and those decisions that we're making. So you could even be thinking about here, how can you repurpose the technology and the systems already available to you. That might mean making a dedicated channel on Teams, for example, where you can invite some key stakeholders. For me, this part of the process is really important, and I couldn't develop any work without having that open communication channel with the stakeholders involved. So simply put, we want to learn about the people that we're designing for, and then we want to take time to make sense of what we've learnt. And I've got this as a separate point because we don't want to come in with assumptions about who Ben is, because Ben's very unpredictable. He'll surprise us. We then want to look at opportunities for how we can improve people's lives, and we want to do so ethically. Only then should we start prototyping while maintaining contact with our community stakeholders. Now, if some of you have caught on, Ben is a real person. He's my husband, and he's in the front row here. So let's all thank Ben. Cool. I'm not sure how I'm going for time, if there's any time for questions. Yeah. Cool. And Ben is on just after me, by the way, in the main theatre. So that's Ben running off to get ready for his talk. And Ben will be talking about offline mode, offline first, not offline mode, in the lecture theatre.
Great talk. Congratulations for Ben. Good sport. Any tips on how to affect change within an organisation on using inclusive language, people, when it's so ingrained in that culture?
Absolutely. So this can be probably the toughest one. I find so I write a lot of the reports myself, and I'll actually use inclusive language in the reports that I am making. So I very much try to push that from the point of view of the same as when I'm in the classroom, being the one that's making the change and setting that example. There's other solutions, such as actually getting community stakeholders in. So I find that while that can be quite costly, it can be really effective when people are being told about the importance of inclusive language from the people who are actually affected by it. Looking at healthcare as an example, bringing people in who actually suffer from disabilities and talking about the way some language impacts them can really change people's focus, because it stops it from being an abstract term. And that's the issue we have with language. These terms, they just feel really abstract. We don't connect them to people. When you're actually faced with the people you're using this terminology for, it can be enough to start pushing for that change.
Any other question? Thank you so much,
Well,
Karen.
thank you.